They tell you that progress is a straight line, but in places like Oakhaven, it looks a lot more like a blueprint drawn in the dark. For 3 generations, the Clark family measured their lives not in dollars, but in inches of topsoil and the predictable rhythm of the seasonal harvest. But at 2:14 a.m. on a rainy Tuesday, that rhythm was permanently shattered. Without a public hearing, without a town hall meeting, and without so much as a courtesy call to the families who had built this county, the mayor signed the zoning variance. Over 80,000 acres of historic farmland were instantly reclassified as an industrial transit corridor. By sunrise, the survey stakes were already being driven into the mud, splitting the Clark homestead squarely down the middle. The air inside the municipal building always smelled faintly of floor wax and stale coffee, a sterile environment where life-altering decisions were wrapped in the dry language of administrative code. When Arthur Clark forced his way into the zoning office at 7 in the morning, the ink on the midnight decree was barely dry. Mayor Richard Vance didn't look like a villain, he looked like an accountant who had stayed up too late looking at spreadsheets. He didn't offer Arthur a seat. Instead, he slid a thick, glossy binder across the laminate desk, a prospectus for the Tri-State Energy Link, a high-pressure natural gas pipeline designed to connect the northern fracking fields to the coastal refineries. "It's eminent domain, Arthur," Vance said, his voice flat, carrying the practiced weight of a man who had delivered this speech to a dozen other farmers earlier that week. "The State Utility Board already cleared the public necessity waiver. The city is just executing the local right-of-way alignment. If you fight the easement valuation in court, the funds just go into an escrow account while the bulldozers start digging anyway. It's better for everyone if you just sign the entry permit and take the settlement check." Arthur didn't touch the binder. His hands, calloused and stained with the dark loam of the valley, stayed flat on his knees. "My grandfather bought that northern ridge in 1944, Richard. Your own uncle helped him clear the timber for the original access road. You're telling me a private energy consortium from Houston can just invalidate 80 years of tax receipts because they want a shortcut to the shipping ports? The law recognizes corporate infrastructure as a public good when it expands the municipal tax base," Vance replied, leaning back in his ergonomic chair, shielding himself behind the invisible wall of institutional authority. "The valley is shrinking, Arthur. The young people are leaving for the city. This pipeline brings 300 construction jobs and a baseline utility franchise fee that will fund our school district for the next 25 years. You can't farm a ghost town." The contrast was absolute. On one side of the desk sat the abstract geometry of the future, lines on a map, projected quarterly revenue, and corporate indemnification clauses. On the other side sat the messy, physical reality of the past, drainage tile layouts, ancestral memory, and the unspoken contract between a community and the earth that sustained it. Arthur left the courthouse without signing the document, the weight of the state's legal machinery pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. When he returned to the farm, the landscape already felt alien. 2 white pickup trucks with commercial license plates were parked on the shoulder of the county road, their engines idling as surveyors in high-visibility vests adjusted their digital transit levels. They were charting the path of least resistance through his cornfields, indifferent to the fact that the path ran directly over the old limestone well house built by his ancestors during the Great Depression. Inside the farmhouse kitchen, Arthur's daughter, Clara, was waiting. A paralegal at a regional firm 3 towns over, she had spent her morning searching through the state's online property registry, looking for some kind of procedural flaw in the city's midnight maneuver. Her face was pale against the gray light coming through the window. The mayor used an emergency statutory loophole from the 1978 Municipal Code, Clara explained, spreading a stack of printed public records across the wooden table. If a project is deemed critical to regional energy security, the local executive can bypass the 90-day notice period for agricultural zoning changes. They didn't break the law, Dad. They just used a law that was written to protect the county during the oil crisis, and they turned it against us. Arthur sat down heavily, the old linoleum floor creaking beneath his boots. "There has to be a countermeasure, Clara. A loophole can't just wipe out a deed. The deed only protects the surface rights and standard residential occupancy," Clara said softly, her professional distance slipping away to reveal the raw panic underneath. "The state owns the deep subsurface mineral rights, and the utility board has the statutory authority to condemn an easement for public transit lines. Unless we can prove the city's title to the municipal right-of-way itself is defective, we don't have standing to file for an injunction. It was then that Arthur remembered the tin box in the cedar closet upstairs. For 40 years, it had remained undisturbed, a repository of old correspondence, agricultural cooperative certificates, and personal letters written by his grandfather, Thomas Clark, during his service in the state legislature in the late 1940s. Thomas had been a quiet man, but his letters were precise, detail-oriented chronicles of an era when the county's borders were still being negotiated over handshakes and local ordinances. Arthur walked up the narrow stairs, his footsteps echoing through the quiet house. The box was heavy, its green paint flaking off in tiny metallic scales. He brought it down to the kitchen table, clearing away the corporate binders and the state statutes to make room for the brittle, yellowed paper of an era long forgotten. The yellowed envelopes inside the green tin box were bundled together with brittle red rubber bands that snapped like dried twigs under Arthur's fingers. These weren't official legal briefs or notarized property deeds, they were personal, handwritten letters sent by Thomas Clark to his wife, Martha, and his brother, Edward, between 1946 and 1951. To an outsider, they looked like the mundane relics of a bygone agrarian lifestyle, discussions about cattle prices, complaints about early autumn frosts, and inquiries about the health of neighbors. But Clara, trained to see the legal mechanics hidden behind ordinary language, noticed something specific about the dates. Thomas Clark hadn't just been a farmer, he had served as a county commissioner during the post-war Reconstruction boom, a period when the state was aggressively expanding its regional infrastructure. As Clara organized the letters chronologically, a distinct narrative began to emerge from the elegant, cursive script. Thomas had been deeply involved in the negotiation of the original municipal charters that established the borders of Oakhaven and its surrounding public utility corridors. "Look at this one from October 1948, Clara said, using the tip of a pen to point at a faded paragraph. Grandfather was writing to Edward about the construction of the old county water reservoir. He mentions that the town council was desperate to secure the Western Valley layout, but they didn't have the liquid capital to purchase the land outright from the agricultural collective." Arthur leaned in, his glasses slipping down his nose as he squinted at his grandfather's handwriting. "What did they do instead? The city has owned the main utility alignment along the ridge for as long as I can remember." "They didn't buy it," Clara murmured, her eyes scanning down the page with increasing speed. "According to Thomas, the city negotiated a conditional reversionary easement. The agricultural collective allowed the municipality to use the ridge for water management and local civic infrastructure, but under one explicit condition. If the land was ever used for commercial transport or private enterprise that didn't directly benefit the immediate agricultural residents of the valley, the title to the right-of-way would automatically dissolve and revert to the adjoining landowners." The room grew very quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. In modern property law, a reversionary easement was a rare and powerful mechanism. It meant that the city's seemingly absolute authority over the transit corridor wasn't an absolute ownership deed, it was a permissive use agreement that came with an expiration date triggered by specific actions. If the pipeline consortium was a private corporation selling natural gas to external coastal markets, their presence on that land would directly violate the terms of the 1948 agreement. The midnight variance signed by Mayor Vance wouldn't just be an aggressive political move, it would be an entirely illegal execution of municipal authority over land the city didn't actually own in fee simple. But a mention in a personal letter wasn't proof that would stand up in a court of law. They needed the actual, executed covenant, the specific document that had been filed with the county recorder of deeds nearly 80 years ago. The challenge was that the county archives had been digitized in the early 2000s, an administrative process that often left behind older, non-standard writers and conditional clauses that didn't fit easily into a modern database template. By 9 o'clock that evening, the kitchen table had become a war room. While the corporate offices of Tri-State Energy Link were undoubtedly dark, their legal machinery was already working against the Clarks. Outside, the distant headlights of a security patrol vehicle glinted off the newly placed surveyor stakes, a silent reminder that the corporate clock was ticking. Clara pulled up the county's public digital land registry on her laptop, cross-referencing the plat map numbers mentioned in Thomas's letters with the current parcel IDs. When she clicked on the historical tracking index for the Northern Ridge Corridor, the screen displayed a frustratingly brief entry, Municipal Right-of-Way, Volume 42, page 118, restructured via administrative order, 1974. There was no link to the original 1948 filing, no digital scan of the signature pages, and no mention of any reversionary clauses. They buried it, Arthur said, his voice hardening with a mixture of anger and resolve. When they digitized the records, they only carried over the active municipal status from the 70s. They treated the old restrictions as if they had simply expired by default. Or someone intentionally chose not to scan the pages that limited the city's long-term corporate utility, Clara added, her legal instincts kicking into high gear. If the original paper ledger still exists, it will be in the basement archives of the old county courthouse. The state archive law requires municipalities to retain the physical master books for all pre-1950 land transactions, even if they've been replaced by digital systems. The contrast between the two sides was becoming sharper by the hour. On one side was a multinational energy corporation armed with satellite mapping, digital eminent domain filings, and millions of dollars in political capital. On the other side were a father and daughter sitting under a single light bulb, relying on the ink and paper memory of a dead man to defend their home. Arthur stood up, walking over to the window. In the darkness, the red warning lights of the pipeline company's heavy equipment, staged 3 miles down the road at the rail yard, blinked in unison against the horizon. They were scheduled to begin clearing the topsoil by Friday morning. They had less than 60 hours to find a piece of paper that everyone else assumed had been reduced to dust decades ago. The basement of the Oakhaven County Courthouse didn't enjoy the climate-controlled luxury of the modern administrative offices upstairs. It was a subterranean maze of concrete walls, exposed copper pipes that sweated in the summer humidity, and row after row of heavy steel shelving holding the physical history of the valley. The air was thick with the scent of decomposing cellulose and old leather. As a paralegal, Clara knew that accessing these archives required more than just curiosity, it required a formal records request form and a specific statutory justification. She had filled out the paperwork under the State Freedom of Information Act before the courthouse doors even unlocked at 8 o'clock Thursday morning. Beside her stood Arthur, carrying the green tin box under his arm like a shield. Behind the security desk sat Evelyn Vance, a distant cousin of the mayor who had managed the county records division for over 30 years. She looked at Clara's paperwork through a pair of thick reading glasses, her expression a mix of bureaucratic indifference and local skepticism. Volume 42 is in the historical annex at the back of the vault, Clara, Evelyn said, her voice echoing slightly in the low-ceilinged room. But I have to tell you, those old leather-bound books haven't been opened since the county council moved everything to the mainframe back in '98. Half the ink is flaking off the parchment, and if it's not in the digital system, the state Supreme Court usually considers the digital index as the definitive record of title. The digital index is a summary, Evelyn, Clara replied, keeping her voice calm and professional, though her pulse was racing. The enabling legislation for the electronic records transition explicitly states that in the event of an omission or clerical error, the original physical instrument remains the primary legal authority. We just want to see the original pages. Evelyn sighed, a heavy sound that signaled her reluctance to leave her desk, but she grabbed a ring of heavy brass keys and led them through the security gate. The historical annex was even darker than the main basement, lit only by wire-caged fluorescent bulbs that flickered with an irritating buzz. On the bottom shelf of the furthest rack sat the pre-1950 land ledgers, massive, sheepskin-bound volumes that looked more like medieval texts than modern municipal records. Arthur helped Clara lift volume 42 onto a metal reading cart. The binding was cracked, and dust motes danced in the harsh fluorescent light as they opened the cover. Clara began flipping through the oversized pages, her fingers tracing the hand-inked headers. Page 110. Page 114. Page 116. When she reached page 118, Arthur let out a sharp breath. The page was there, but it looked different from the others. The bottom third of the ledger paper had a rectangular shadow where an official addendum had once been affixed with water-soluble library paste. The paste had dried up decades ago, leaving behind only a dark brown stain and a faint grid of pencil lines. The actual document, the conditional reversionary rider signed by Thomas Clark and the 1948 Town Council, was missing from the book. "It's gone," Arthur whispered, his hand shaking as he looked at the empty space. "Richard must have had someone come down here and pull it before he signed that variance on Tuesday." No, Clara said, leaning closer, her eyes scanning the margins of the page. Look at the binding thread at the spine. It hasn't been cut or tampered with recently. If someone removed that rider, they did it a long time ago. But look at the cross-reference notation in the top right corner. There's a handwritten file number, Aviation Transit Subbox 4. Clara looked at Evelyn, who was standing near the door, checking her watch. Evelyn, where are the ancillary municipal files from the 48 infrastructure expansion? The items that didn't fit into the standard deed ledgers? Evelyn pointed toward a stack of gray cardboard litigation boxes stacked in the corner, covered in a thick layer of undisturbed gray grime. Those are the old project files from the Department of Public Works. They were scheduled to be incinerated during the county warehouse consolidation 5 years ago, but the Historical Society filed a stay. No one has catalogued them. Arthur didn't wait for permission. He walked over to the stack, his boots kicking up dust as he pulled down the box labeled 1947 to 1950, Valley Water and Transit Developments. The cardboard was soft from decades of humidity, nearly tearing in his hands as he placed it on the floor. Inside were hundreds of loose documents, engineering blueprints drawn on blue linen paper, cancelled municipal bonds, and internal memos typed on onionskin paper. Clara knelt beside him, her hands moving methodically through the files. The contrast between this unorganized mountain of history and the sleek, digital precision of the pipeline company's legal strategy was terrifying. The corporation had algorithms and high-speed databases, they had a failing cardboard box in a damp basement. 10 minutes passed in tense silence. Then, near the bottom of the third folder, Clara's hand stopped. She pulled out an legal-sized envelope made of heavy brown craft paper. It wasn't sealed, it was tied with a piece of faded green twine. Written on the front in the identical, elegant cursive script they had seen in the kitchen the night before were the words. To be preserved in perpetuity by the Clerk of Courts, retained copy of Valley Agricultural Covenant. Inside was the missing piece of the puzzle. It was the original, fully executed 1948 rider, complete with the embossed gold seal of the Oakhaven Municipal Corporation and the signatures of the entire post-war town council. Clara's eyes skipped past the standard legal preamble straight to Section 4, Paragraph B. The language was unambiguous. Should the municipality or its corporate assigns attempt to utilize said right-of-way for any private commercial conveyance of petroleum, gas, or industrial commodities not consumed within the geographic boundaries of this valley, the easement granted herein shall terminate by operation of law, and full title shall instantly revert to the original grantors or their lawful heirs. The air inside the courtroom of State Circuit Judge Margaret Reyes was heavy with the scent of wet wool and anxiety. Outside, the rain continued to beat against the tall, arched windows, mirroring the storm that had been building over the Oakhaven Valley for the past 72 hours. It was Friday morning, 9:15 a.m. Less than 3 miles away, the heavy diesel engines of the Tri-State Energy Link construction crews were idling at the edge of Arthur Clark's northern pasture, waiting for the radio call that would authorize them to breach the perimeter fence. At the defense table sat Mayor Richard Vance, flanked by 2 corporate litigators from a high-profile firm in the state capital. They wore identical charcoal suits, their leather briefcases packed with glossy engineering charts, certified municipal declarations, and a copy of the emergency zoning variance signed under the cover of night. They looked completely at ease, carrying the quiet confidence of men who had successfully dissolved local property rights in 100 different rural counties across the country. On the other side of the aisle sat Clara and Arthur Clark. They had no legal team, no corporate backing, and no glossy presentations. In front of Clara lay a single, water-stained manila folder containing the 1948 brown craft paper envelope and the yellowed letters of Thomas Clark. Your Honor, the lead corporate attorney, Marcus Vance, the mayor's cousin and chief counsel for the Pipeline Consortium, began, his voice smooth and resonant as he addressed the bench. We are facing a critical project delay that costs our client upwards of $45,000 for every hour the heavy machinery sits idle. The City of Oakhaven executed a lawful administrative variance under Section 12 of the State Emergency Energy Code. The public benefit of this pipeline has already been adjudicated and approved by the Utility Board. The respondents are attempting to use an outdated, unindexed historical anomaly to halt a multi-million-dollar infrastructure project that serves the economic interest of the entire region. Judge Reyes, a formidable woman with 20 years of experience on the local bench, looked over her glasses at the corporate team, then turned her gaze toward Clara. The court is familiar with the Emergency Energy Code, Counselor. Miss Clark, you are appearing as a representative of your father's estate and the adjoining landowners. The digital registry shows a clear, unencumbered municipal right-of-way across your property since 1974. What legal basis do you have to request an immediate emergency stay of construction? Clara stood up, her legs shaking slightly, but her voice remained steady. She didn't look at the corporate lawyers, she kept her eyes fixed on the judge. Your Honor, the digital registry is incomplete, Clara said, stepping forward to hand a set of certified photocopies to the bailiff. We are presenting the original, physical rider to the 1948 Oakhaven Municipal Right-of-Way Agreement. Recovered from the county's uncatalogued Department of Public Works archives just yesterday afternoon. This document was executed by the town council and my grandfather, Thomas Clark, who served as a county commissioner at the time. Marcus Vance didn't look up from his tablet, offering a dismissive wave of his hand. Your Honor, any unindexed covenants from nearly 80 years ago are considered extinguished by default under the State Marketable Title Act, which limits historical property restrictions to a 30-year look-back period unless explicitly renewed. That would be correct, Counselor, Clara countered immediately, her paralegal training kicking into high gear, except for the fact that the Marketable Title Act contains an explicit statutory exemption under Section 5, Paragraph C. Historical restrictions do not expire if the holder of the reversionary interest is a government entity or if the easement itself was granted under a conditional civic trust for public utility. The city accepted this land not as an absolute owner, but as a trustee for the agricultural collective. Judge Reyes leaned forward, taking the photocopies from the bailiff. The courtroom fell into a tense, breathless silence as the judge began reading the elegant cursive script of the 1948 covenant. The contrast between Marcus Vance's dismissive posture and the judge's deepening frown was palpable. The language here is quite specific, Judge Reyes noted, her finger tracing the lines of the text. It states that if the municipality attempts to use the right-of-way for private commercial conveyance of commodities not consumed within the valley, the easement dissolves by operation of law. Counselor, is the natural gas transported by the Tri-State Energy Link intended for local municipal distribution within Oakhaven? Marcus Vance cleared his throat, adjusting his silk tie. The project expands the regional capacity. Your Honor. While the immediate gas is destined for the coastal export terminal, the economic infrastructure taxes directly benefit. That wasn't my question, Judge Reyes interrupted, her voice dropping an octave. Does a single cubic foot of the product traveling through this specific pipeline hook into the local Oakhaven utility grid for the use of these farmers? No, Your Honor, the corporate lawyer admitted, his smooth demeanor finally beginning to crack. But the 1974 restructuring ordinance overrode those historical constraints. An administrative ordinance cannot unilaterally extinguish a private reversionary property right without just compensation or a formal condemnation proceeding directed at the specific restriction itself, Clara argued, stepping closer to the bench. The city simply ignored the rider when they digitized the deeds, hoping that the passage of time would erase the memory of the contract. My grandfather's letters prove that the city was fully aware of these limitations when they took possession of the ridge. Judge Reyes closed the photocopy folder with a sharp, echoing snap that sounded like a starter's pistol in the silent courtroom. She looked down from the elevated bench, her gaze skipping past the expensive, tailored suits of the corporate litigation team and resting directly on Mayor Richard Vance. The mayor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face losing what little color it had left. This court finds that the 1948 reversionary covenant is not a mere historical curiosity, Judge Reyes declared, her voice ringing with absolute clarity. It is a valid, binding property restriction that limits the municipal authority over the Northern Ridge Corridor. The city of Oakhaven cannot grant a zoning variance or an easement to a private corporate entity for a project that directly violates the explicit terms under which the city gained access to that land in the first place. When Mayor Vance signed that midnight variance, he wasn't just executing city business, he was attempting to sign away a legal boundary that his office did not possess the title to yield. Marcus Vance stood up quickly, his hands spreading wide in a gesture of desperate calculation. Your Honor, we request a 24-hour stay of execution on any order to allow our executive board to review the financial impacts. As I stated, the idle machinery costs. The machinery can sit idle, Counselor, Judge Reyes interrupted, her gavel coming down with definitive force. An immediate emergency injunction is hereby granted against the Tri-State Energy Link in the city of Oakhaven. All survey work, land clearing, and construction activity on the Clark property and all adjoining parcels covered under the 1948 Agricultural Collective Agreement must cease immediately. If a single bulldozer crosses that perimeter fence before a full evidentiary hearing on the title can be held, I will hold both the corporate officers and the mayor in criminal contempt of court. We are adjourned. The corporate lawyers didn't speak. They packed their leather briefcases with rapid, mechanical movements, their phones already buzzing in their pockets as they hurried out the side doors of the courtroom to alert their headquarters in Houston. Mayor Vance remained at his desk for a moment longer, looking across the aisle at Arthur Clark. For a second, it looked like he wanted to say something, perhaps an apology, or perhaps a warning, but he ultimately turned away, following his legal team into the corridor. Arthur sat still for a long time, his hand resting on the green tin box. The heavy weight that had settled on his chest since Tuesday morning finally began to lift, replaced by a profound, quiet exhaustion. Clara reached over, wrapping her hand over his. "We did it, Dad," she whispered, a tear finally breaking through her professional composure and tracing a path down her cheek. "The letters held up." "Your grandfather held it up," Arthur corrected softly, his voice thick with emotion as he looked down at the faded elegant cursive script visible through the clear plastic folder. "He knew that the day would come when the town would forget its roots, and he left us a map to find our way back." By 11:30 a.m., the rain had stopped, leaving behind a cold, clean wind that swept through the Oakhaven Valley, scattering the heavy gray clouds. When Arthur and Clara drove the old farm truck back up the county road, the scene at the northern pasture had completely transformed. The white pickup trucks belonging to the corporate surveyors were no longer idling on the shoulder. The survey stakes, those high-visibility orange markers that had split the historic homestead down the middle, had been pulled from the mud and stacked neatly beside the drainage ditch. Across the road, 3 of their neighboring farmers, men who had spent their own mornings waiting in anxious silence for news from the courthouse, were standing near the fence line. When they saw Arthur's truck slow down, they didn't shout or celebrate wildly. They simply tipped their hats in a gesture of deep, communal respect. They knew the fight wasn't entirely over, the Energy Consortium would likely appeal, or try to restructure their pipeline route around the historic collective borders. But the line in the dirt had been drawn, and the machinery of corporate progress had been forced to stop and reckon with the people who built the valley. That evening, the Clark kitchen was warm, filled with the rich aroma of stew simmering on the stove. The modern corporate binders and the state statutory printouts had been moved to the corner desk, completely overshadowed by the green tin box that sat open in the center of the wooden table. Arthur picked up the last letter his grandfather had written to his brother Edward in the spring of 1951, reading the final paragraph aloud to Clara. "The soil we tend is more than just dirt and property lines, Edward," Thomas Clark had written nearly 80 years ago. "It is a ledger of our family's sweat, our sacrifices, and our promises to the generations we will never live to see. The towns will grow, the politicians will change, and the paper deeds may fade, but as long as we keep our records true and our memories long, the land will always remember who it belongs to." Arthur folded the brittle paper carefully, placing it back inside the envelope and tying the faded green twine. He closed the lid of the green box, the metallic latch clicking shut with a sound that felt as permanent, and as unyielding, as the earth beneath their feet.